that New Year's Eve started out ordinarily for 18-year-old Nancy Mestre, a time for rest, celebration, and gifts. The girl had her whole life ahead of her, full of dreams that were just beginning to come true. Who could have predicted that this New Year's night would turn into a bloody tragedy? A young, vivacious girl who had just celebrated a victory admission to a university in the USA. It seemed a bright future awaited her, but fate had other plans. Nancy Mestre was born in 1975 in Barranquilla, a million-strong Colombian city. She grew up in the cozy family of Martin Mestre and Nancy Vargas, with her biological brother. From a young age, Nancy stood out for her sociable nature and cheerfulness. The children had a wonderful relationship with their parents, based on deep respect. Nancy considered her mother her best mentor, and her father became the dearest person to her. The Mestre family lived quite comfortably, which allowed Nancy to get a decent education in one of the best colleges in the country, Mary Mountain. Even before fluently mastering English, the girl dreamed of studying in the USA. This country sparked lively interest in her and a desire to live there. On the eve of New Year's 1993, the family gathered to celebrate. Initially, they planned to celebrate elsewhere, but due to unforeseen circumstances, they changed their plans. Nancy's brother had recently been injured in a soccer match and temporarily lost mobility. Because of this, they decided to stay at home. No one could even suspect that this idyll would soon be shattered by a brutal crime. But at this very moment, a blow was to be expected. That New Year's Eve, the Mestre family had a special reason to celebrate. Nancy had been admitted to a university in the USA. The girl was approaching her dream of studying abroad, and it seemed that nothing could overshadow her joy. But unfortunately, fate had other plans, not allowing the young heroine's bright dreams to come true. Around 3:40 a.m., businessman Jaime Santa de Carmani drove up to the Mestre house. The man was a decade older than Nancy, but that didn't stop him from asking the girl out on a New Year's date. Apparently, they had been dating for some time before that. Jaime came from a respected family, so Nancy's parents agreed to their daughter's date. Nancy herself also dreamed of celebrating the new year with her boyfriend's family. However, her parents set a condition. Their daughter had to return home by 3 in the morning, and Jaime had to ensure her safety. The lovers accepted these terms and went off to celebrate. So as not to spoil their daughter's holiday, the adults left the light on in the hallway and went to bed. A few hours later, the head of the family woke up and saw that Nancy still wasn't home. Her room was empty, which extremely worried the man. At dawn, he rushed to look for his daughter in popular nightclubs where she might be. Calls to Nancy's cell phone went unanswered, but he didn't dare call the police yet. The father contacted the girl's friends, but they also knew nothing about her whereabouts. What could have happened that New Year's night? Where did the joyful girl who was celebrating her dream coming true disappear to? No one could even guess what a hidden threat this date with a respected gentleman would turn out to be for Nancy. After all, this night became the beginning of a horrible tragedy. After fruitlessly searching for his daughter in nightclubs, the father headed to the house of Jaime, who had taken Nancy on a date and was supposed to bring her back. The man assumed that the girl might be there. Instead, he found Jaime's mother, who was wiping blood off the floor, a sight that looked extremely alarming. When the worried father asked, the woman replied that her son and Nancy had gone to the hospital, and the blood belonged to his daughter. She couldn't explain anything more. She didn't even know what exactly had happened to the girl and what condition she was in. Overwhelmed with anxiety, the man rushed to the medical facility. All this took place around 6 a.m. At the hospital, Nancy's father was met by the father of her gentleman, Jaime, who told an incredible story. Allegedly, while at his house, Nancy had tried to take her own life by shooting herself in the head with a pistol. But the girl's father rejected this version as absurd. His cheerful and happy daughter had no reason for suicide. Nancy had just turned 18, with her whole life ahead of her. Until recently, she had been celebrating her admission to an American university, a dream that was coming true. Could such a joyful event be a reason for depression? Of course not. There was an obvious substitution of facts. After all, the young student had never given any reason to doubt her mental state. Her life was shaping up in the best way possible, and she was eagerly awaiting her studies in the USA. So Jaime's father's version seemed complete nonsense. And how could a young girl do such a thing on New Year's night while visiting a friend? It simply didn't add up in the concerned father's head, and here's why. Mr. Mestre spoke with the medical staff who admitted his daughter, and they told him extremely disturbing information. It turns out that Nancy was brought to the hospital completely naked, covered only by a sheet. At the same time, the girl showed almost no signs of life. Most striking were the details about her appearance, all covered in sand, dirt, and vegetation, as if she had been dragged through the woods somewhere. There were no hints of this in the explanations given by James' father. After all, according to the first version, everything happened at the home of Nancy's gentleman's family, where she allegedly tried to shoot herself. But then why were traces of nature found on the girl's body, and why was she naked? Obviously, we are being misled, hiding the true horrific events of that New Year's night. It all looked extremely eerie. Nancy's father, Jaime Mestre, was horrified, anticipating the worst and realizing that his daughter's life was hanging by a thread. Returning home, he told his family about these dramatic events. Relatives immediately rushed to the hospital. However, the doctors' prognoses were disappointing. They discovered too serious an injury in Nancy, which caused complications. For the next 8 days, the girl fought for her life, undergoing numerous surgeries in a coma. The doctors made every effort to save her. But unfortunately, all their efforts were in vain. The situation was relentlessly unfolding in the direction of some eerie denouement. Someone had brutally dealt with an innocent girl that New Year's night, trampling her young life and dreams. But the details I will tell you now will shock you. When the family was told the terrible news that their loved one could not be saved, that the girl would not return to life, the relatives had to make one of the most difficult decisions. They gave permission to disconnect Nancy from life support on January 9, 1994. Relatives gathered in the ward where the young beauty lay motionless on the bed. They embraced each other and began to sing a children's lullaby, the last song, to say goodbye to their beloved. Sobs rang out, no doubt. None of them yet knew about the true horrors surrounding the girl's death. So, without regaining consciousness, Nancy left this world. She never got to tell her own story about what happened that New Year's night at the home of her gentleman, Jaime. But the girl's family rejected all the false versions about her alleged suicide. Relatives turned to the police with a demand to thoroughly investigate this case and get to the bottom of the true circumstances. It was obvious to them that James' family was hiding something. Law enforcement listened to the demands and took up the investigation. The results of forensic examinations rejected the version of suicide. No traces of gunpowder were found on the victim's hand, which are characteristic of a shot to the temple, but they were found on Nancy's other hand. This meant that she had been shot and obviously clumsily staging a suicide. Someone obviously wanted to hide the terrible truth of that New Year's night, when carefree celebrations suddenly turned criminal. However, the perpetrator's efforts to mask the events turned out to be unprofessional, leaving behind glaring evidence that indicated someone's criminal intent. And this was just the beginning of strange inconsistencies, because the autopsy results of Nancy Mestre's body revealed a horrifying truth. It turned out that on the night of her death, the girl became a victim of intimate violence by 2 men at once. Traces of intimate relations with 2 different partners were found on her body. But the most horrifying thing was something else: the numerous abrasions, bruises, and bodily injuries on Nancy's body. Obviously, she actively resisted her abusers. These wounds and injuries remained after a desperate struggle for life. The girl became a victim of brutal intimate violence, which someone then tried to hide. No less eerie details. Under the nails of the deceased, doctors found pieces of someone else's skin. This is a typical picture when a victim vigorously defends herself against attackers, leaving similar traces on their bodies. These findings made it possible to identify one of Nancy's rapists and murderers. All these terrible details debunked the false versions about the girl's alleged suicide. It had already become obvious that the incident was of a criminal nature. An innocent young woman fell victim to a violent crime in order to conceal another act of intimate violence. In the house of Jaime Santa, where Nancy went on a New Year's date, they found the deadly weapon, a pistol wrapped in bloody shorts, under the bed. Ballistic examination confirmed that it was the gun used to kill the girl. There was no doubt left this was murder. Law enforcement officially qualified the case as premeditated murder and opened a criminal investigation. The main suspects in the investigation were Jaime Santa and his relatives. After all, the crime took place in their home, and traces of gunpowder were found on Jaime's hand, evidence of his involvement in the event. A thorough analysis of the crime scene and traces inevitably led the investigation to the suspects. After the investigation gathered irrefutable evidence of the intimate violence and murder of Nancy Mestre, all that remained was to await the results of the forensic examinations. It was on them that depended what charges would be brought against the persons involved in this brutal case. Meanwhile, the incident gained wide publicity. The grief of the Mestre family found a resounding response in the public. Soon, mass pickets were held in support of the relatives of the deceased young woman. People demanded the inevitable punishment for her rapists and murderers, who so mercilessly cut short a young life. Public resonance always intensifies in cases where the victim is a minor. And when it comes to intimate violence and the murder of a young beauty, it especially outrages people. Society demands justice and immediate punishment for the criminals. A few days after the incident, the father of the deceased Nancy, Martin Mestre, received an anonymous letter. The message described the likely cause of the girl's murder. According to one version, Nancy caught her boyfriend Jaime in perverted sexual relations. Fearing exposure, the perverts brutally violated the girl intimately and then killed her with a shot. Afterwards, they wanted to get rid of the victim's body by throwing it somewhere in the woods. But Nancy still showed signs of life, so they decided to take her to the hospital. The name of the anonymous author of the letter was never established. In any case, this version of the unnatural events formed the basis for further investigation and the search for the guilty. Unfortunately, the main suspect in the criminal case decided to brazenly evade justice. During the investigation, Jaime Santa suddenly disappeared in an unknown direction. Obviously, he guessed the investigators' intentions to arrest him, so he decided to flee and avoid responsibility for his crimes. Law enforcement couldn't find the fugitive, despite all attempts to contact him. Jaime's relatives claimed they didn't know where he was or what had happened to him. But this lie was obvious. The perpetrator had simply disappeared to hide from justice. Despite this, investigators soon officially declared Jaime internationally wanted and brought charges against him in absentia for the sexual assault and intentional murder of Nancy Mestre. Since the perpetrator himself could not be caught, the trial against him began in absentia. Substantial evidence was presented in court. This included traces of gunpowder on Jaime's hands, his genetic imprints on the victim's body after the intimate violence, and pieces of his skin from under the deceased's nails. All of this unequivocally indicated the fugitive's direct involvement in the bloody crime against Nancy. But due to his absence from the process, Jaime could not refute or confirm the available evidence. But that's not the most interesting part, because what happened next changed everything. In 1996, the Colombian court sentenced Jaime Santa, who was on the run at the time. The perpetrator was sentenced in absentia to 27 years in prison for the sexual assault and intentional murder of 18-year-old Nancy Mestre. All the evidence gathered unequivocally testified to the fugitive's guilt in the brutal crime against the innocent girl. Prosecutors believed that Jaime Santa could have fled to the United States and gone into hiding there. Already in April 1998, the criminal's name was added to Interpol's international wanted list. Since then, fruitless searches for Jaime began around the world. Law enforcement tried to involve the public in the search through the media. From time to time, calls came in from people who allegedly saw the wanted man in various countries of Latin America. However, all this information turned out to be fruitless. Undoubtedly, Jaime's parents, wealthy people, provided their son with all the necessary resources for unhindered escape and maneuvers to evade justice. According to investigators, the murderer could be hiding anywhere in the world under a false name and with forged documents. That's why catching him proved impossible. The tragedy of Nancy's death also cruelly affected her family. The girl's parents could not cope with the grief and divorced. The family's son moved to live in the USA, and the mother of the murdered girl moved to Spain. Relatives flew around the world in despair. However, Nancy's father, Martin Mestre, could not come to terms with such injustice. A retired naval officer familiar with modern technology, the man decided to take the search for the fugitive into his own hands. There are many examples of relatives of victims making every effort to catch the perpetrator. And yet, I have never heard of such an uncompromising and persistent fight for justice as in the case of Martin Mestre. Realizing that the official search channels had proved fruitless, Martin Mestre decided to take matters into his own hands. However, he could not simply turn to the family of the missing criminal. This would immediately expose his intentions, so the man resorted to tricks. Martin set up 4 fake accounts on social networks at once. 2 male and 2 female profiles imitated persons of the same Arabic nationality as Jaime Santa's family. In this way, the victim hoped to win the trust of the fugitive's entourage and get on his trail. It took Martin Mestre a whole 26 years to finally catch the suspect red-handed. While monitoring the correspondence of Jaime's relatives, he had a hunch that he might be hiding in Brazil. The country is big, but thanks to constant monitoring of mentions in the correspondence, the man again came across the trail of the name Samaria. This was similar to Santa Marta in Colombia, where Jaime was from, but it turned out to be about Santa Maria, a small town near the Brazilian capital. Martin immediately passed this tip to Interpol. There they began to study candidates for the possible identity of the fugitive Jaime in the vicinity of Santa Maria. And finally, they came across a person named Enrique dos Santos Abdullah. According to all external signs and profile, he was very similar to the wanted man. I often have to observe how relatives of victims spare no effort to search for criminals. However, the persistence and endurance of Martin Mestre are truly impressive. Needless to say, how much resilience and faith in justice he had to show in order to tirelessly track the enemy for so many years. In the end, Martin's mission was finally crowned with success. He managed to point law enforcement to the likely hideout of Nancy's missing killer. All the details, from age to the similarity of passport names, matched. Covert investigative operations were established for the identified person in the suburbs of Santa Maria. When this person spilled a drink in a cafe, his fingerprints matched those of the wanted Jaime Santa. There was no doubt left it was him. All the details unequivocally indicated that this person, who was hiding in Brazil under the name Enrique dos Santos Abdullah, was in fact the wanted murderer. To apprehend the fugitive, a joint operation was conducted together with the Brazilian police. On January 29, 2020, the moment of truth came. Jaime Santa was arrested. The man did not resist and admitted that it was indeed him. However, he categorically denied his involvement in the girl's murder. Martin Mestre received the news of the criminal's arrest with a frenzied emotional outburst. The person whose search had taken him about 30 years was finally caught. Unable to hold back his sobs, the distraught father fell to his knees with excitement. He then called his wife and son, and together they sincerely thanked God that justice would seemingly finally be restored. However, as is often the case in cases of this kind, everything turned out to be much more complicated than one might expect. During Interpol's investigation, it was discovered that Jaime did not flee to Brazil alone. Big money played a decisive role in his secretive escape and subsequent carefree life. It turned out that the criminal's parents not only financially supported their son for a long period, but also helped him forge documents. In Brazil, Jaime settled in quite well with fake papers. He obtained a driver's license, bought a car, opened his own business, and successfully developed it. Moreover, he even managed to get married, and the couple even had 2 children. At the same time, the investigation also revealed the criminal's unfortunate oversights. In particular, in the birth certificates of his children, Santa used his own real name. Before his arrest, he also did not rush to officially legalize his marriage with the woman from whom he had children. However, literally a month after his detention, he got married. Obviously, Brazilian laws allowed him to avoid extradition to Colombia if a person had an official marriage there. When Santa was taken to a Brazilian prison, he did not even think of admitting his guilt in the 30-year-old crime. According to his new fantasies, allegedly Nancy used prohibited substances that night and overdid it with alcohol. Therefore, she stayed at his house for a long time and did not want her parents to catch her in such an indecent state. To bring the girl to her senses, she was allegedly put in the shower after intimate contact, and when Santa entered the bathroom, he saw the body of his unconscious girlfriend with signs of life and took her to the hospital in the hope of saving her. Hearing such an absurd version again, it's hard not to smile skeptically. How illogical it sounds in the light of the evidence traces of intimate violence, and murder. Moreover, the results of toxicological examinations unequivocally refuted this lie. No harmful substances were found in Nancy's body. Although Santa tried in every possible way to wriggle out thanks to his lawyers, all these stories and discrepancies in the testimony only harmed him. The court regarded the contradictory testimonies of the accused himself and his defenders as additional evidence of the crime. Even the long-awaited arrest of the criminal did not guarantee a just punishment. Despite all the efforts of Martin and his efforts, the Brazilian court made a meager decision for Jaime. As it turned out, due to the statute of limitations of 20 years, he could not be extradited to Colombia. The opinions of the judges were divided, so the 57-year-old Santa was released, declaring the only charge only in forging documents. Of course, this was a terrible blow to the family of the deceased Nancy. All the father's tireless work seemed to have gone in vain. Together with Nancy's relatives and friends, Martin hired American lawyers who specialize in international cases. They filed a number of official appeals demanding a review of the Brazilian justice verdict regarding Santa. All the evidence of the crime, the unprecedented history of the search for the missing murderer, Martin's enormous efforts, all this had to be taken into account when making the final verdict. And this tireless struggle was finally crowned with success. A decision was made to extradite the dangerous criminal Jaime Santa to Colombia and reconvict him on all charges: sexual assault and the murder of 18-year-old Nancy Mestre. On April 18, 2023, the long-awaited day came. Santa was officially deported to Colombia, where a new trial awaited him. Law enforcement detained the fugitive in custody. However, despite all efforts, Jaime's influential and wealthy family again managed to release him on bail. But soon he escaped again. But already on May 1, 2023, he was quickly found and arrested for good. The only thing that has not yet been established is the identity of the second abuser, Jaime's accomplice on that terrible New Year's night. But the girl's relatives hope that at the trial, Santa will give up his subordinate, and he will also receive the proper punishment. Unlike Jaime himself, his family has so far avoided any charges of complicity or concealment of the crime. Although undoubtedly, the wealth and connections of this family played a significant role in the attempts to free Santa from responsibility. Surely, each of you will agree the story of Nancy Mestre has touched the hearts of many. Cases where children or young people become victims of brutality are always bitterly perceived by society. People did not accidentally actively respond to this tragedy, demanding the inevitable punishment for the girl's murderers. As often happens in high-profile cases, anonymous letters and messages appear with the alleged disclosure of the circumstances of the crime, and by no means each of them carries constructive value for the investigation. But along with this, it was the restless faith and struggle of the victim's family that became the driving force for the successful completion of this complex case. It took him a whole 26 years to make all these preparations, and when finally the slightest clue appeared about the possible hiding place of Jaime Santa, Martin instantly passed this information to Interpol. From him, law enforcement received the key that led them to the finally detained murderer. Thanks to Martin's indications, the investigators were able to identify and take into custody the missing person, whom they had not been able to find for so long. This story is instructive not only for its soulful fervor, it also eloquently illustrates how fighters for justice can achieve their goal, even in spite of the corrupt system and its double standards. After all, despite the almost complete refusal of the Brazilian justice system to extradite the detainee to Colombia, Martin and his team managed to get this decision reviewed and the criminal extradited. Now it remains to hope that the court in Colombia will be impartial and will convict Jaime Santa on all charges, and in parallel, it will be possible to reveal the identity of Nancy's second rapist, if Santa gives up his accomplice. This case must end with the complete triumph of justice over criminal impunity and corruption. Only in this way can the bright memory of the innocent